Well, you guys certainly have been handing me some difficult ones this cycle. We already had The Witness and Beginner's Guide, and now we have Anno 2070. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, why is this such a difficult game? Well, it'd be kind of like doing a rumination on civilization. It's not quite like that. In fact, there's some very key differences here. But ultimately, I'm going to sit back and I'm like, well, this is basically just going to be a review. There's not a lot of story to discuss or analyze. No real themes, no complex ideals or characters or anything, really. Now, of course, Anno isn't quite like that. What I want to talk about first is the idea of a plotless game. Now, this is not a plotless game, but I just want to talk about that concept for a minute. I've actually discussed the very idea of flavor lore in the past, the idea of something that has a degree of background lore that helps flesh out the setting and make it so that you understand a little bit better what you're looking at and how you're looking at it, and it kind of adds a degree of continuity to the work. And Mario Kart is actually probably the best example of this I could think of. Mario Kart on the Wii U specifically is a very clear example of flavor lore. I did a whole video about that, or excuse me, a whole stream about that actually. But then you have other games where it's mostly flavor lore, but they have a plot, or rather, they have a campaign mode, is actually the better way to put it. And I've often wondered if there's like a specific term for that. Token campaign mode, maybe, or token story mode? Because there's a lot of games I've played over the years of many different genres where it's basically a game designed around, endless play, basically. That's the bulk of the game. Empire at War would actually be a good example of this. But there's also a story mode that happens to be over here that you can also go through if you really want to. So I can't call this a completely plotless game. Not like Mario Kart, which has no plot. Not like Civilization, which has no plot. This is a game with a plot and a game with a setting. It has a fairly well-established setting, and it's got some themes underlying it, and it's got a fairly large amount of flavor lore running in the background. The Anno series in general all occurs within the same continuity, it's the same timeline of Earth. In fact, a couple of characters actually reference previous characters from previous Anno's games, and that continues forward into the future as well. There's actually something in 2205, I think, is the next one, where you can find out about this ancient AI, structure thing, and it's an arc, that kind of a stuff. And of course, the world has been, well, getting worse over the years thanks to some issues and some problems environmentally and whatnot. But that's just adding to the flavor and making each game feel different from a gameplay perspective. Of course, the main bulk of the process is all on the gameplay. Now, that's where I want to talk about it, because when I first looked at this game, I thought it was an Empire at War game, like a 4X Lite. I was very wrong about that. Actually, I have played a game like this before, though. And it occurred to me immediately as I got like maybe 10 minutes into the game. This is like Caesar 3. Now, there's actually several of the Caesar games. I think they went up to 4. I'm not actually sure on that. They're older games. They're back from the 90s and early 2000s. But the Caesar series was a series of PC games which was kind of SimCity mixed with RTS elements, mixed with some very small 4X elements, like very, very light 4X elements. And it was kind of this in-between thing. I actually referred to those as provincial sims back in the day. So I think I'm going to apply to that here as well, because this very much feels like the same thing, just touched up for a modern generation and with lots more detail. Of course, that's one of the highlights of these types of games, because even though this is a provincial sim, this is one of those games that kind of feels like something else. So I mentioned Caesar 3 there. In Caesar 3, you didn't have to deal with all of the specific detailed resources, right? In this one, you do. What I mean by this is, let's just give you a theoretical example. Let's say you've got an island here. I love the island thing. I'll talk about that in a bit. And you need oil on this island in order to get to your refinery, in order to process it, okay? Turn your crude into refined. Very logical. Well, your oil refiner is way out here in the ocean, and as a result of being out in the ocean, it's got its own little warehouse, which is where the oil is stored, not here. You need to actually manually get those resources from point A to point B. That means buying ships and having them set up on trade routes in order to make sure the resources are where they need to be. That may not sound like a big deal, but for any gamer who's used to, the hammer space style of inventory, where, if you have 3 iron in your entire civilization, you have access to it wherever you need it, it might be a little bit of a variance, because you have to actually get the iron, the supplies, basically, from point A to point B. Anyone who's played extensive grand strategy games, who actually deals with things like supply lines and whatnot, might have an easier time of this kind of a thing. And that thing, and a lot of other things like that, is why I call these detail-oriented games. I've played a lot of detail-oriented games in the past. All of different genres, actually, which I find fascinating. Sometimes there's detail-oriented games that are FPSs. I've had a stealth one or two, a lot of strategy games, especially turn-based back in the day. And all the detail-oriented games, well, I mean, I've kind of already described it. The whole point is you can't just... Basically, gameplay conveniences are removed, and instead you, the player, have to make sure that every little piece is functioning, and every little piece that supports those little pieces is also functioning, and however many layers down it wants to go. Usually it does cut it off at a certain point, but in some cases, I actually remember distinctly a war game I played where you had to actually recruit non-military personnel to support the factories in order to make sure the resources from the factories got to the actual munitions depots, where you also had to recruit people for, in order to get them, in order to actually produce weapons, which then had to be transported to your barracks, and then people be trained in them in order to be able to use them. And each soldier, each unit had to have arms attached to them, or else they'd be going out into the field unequipped. That's what I mean by detail-oriented gameplay, and that is this in spades. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. It is my personal opinion that that you could go too far with any given thing. I mean, duh, right? But if that's what you want, if you want to micromanage, if you want to be detail-oriented, if you want to manage every single tiny little detail about your city, this is actually probably a really good game for you. Now, this is a good time to talk about one of the things I actually don't like about this game, and that's the UI, or the UI, if you prefer. It's kind of against the player. I've talked before about how UI is really, really important to good gameplay design in a lot of games, especially games where you're managing, large groups of things, like a sim builder or an army game or an RTS game or a 4X game or a grand strategy game. Having a good UI is really, really helpful to actually figuring out what the heck you're doing and when you're doing it and how you're doing it and so forth and so on. This game has basically the opposite of that. It takes real serious getting used to figure out where things are, where the information you want is, being able to determine, okay, well, this works here and this goes here. And the in-game, I hesitate to call it a tutorial, is just not helpful. What I ended up doing myself personally, I mean, I got a kind of a feel for it, but after a while I was like, okay, hang on. And I just went and I found the wiki, which is actually quite helpful, and some Reddit threads, and I was like, oh, that's how that works. And I didn't even realize Basalt was a limited resource, that kind of a thing. So this is a game that takes a while to get into. Big, steep learning curve. And even once you're into it, it's still kind of a hassle. There's a few times where it's like you have to close the window, open up another window, scan for the right thing you need, close that window, reopen the first window and do it that, as opposed to just being able to, as some games will do, have the information displayed in the relevant information. There's a term for that. It's something like context-sensitive information or something like that. To use an RPG equivalent, imagine if you mouse over a axe you just got, and a little pop-up window will show up next to the axe showing the stats of the weapon you currently have equipped, like, say, a dagger. So you can see the axe and the dagger right next to each other. And some games will go even further and literally list the differences in stats between the two. What Anno does, equivalently, of course, is it makes it so that you've got this axe, and it's got some stats on it, and that's it. If you want to find out if it's better, you got to put away the axe, go pick up the dagger, inspect the dagger, look at the dagger and say, okay, and basically memorize what you need here, put away the dagger, pick up the axe, and be like, okay, this is better, or worse, as the case may be. And it just kind of made it an obstacle to enjoy the game. But that is probably my only really big complaint about this game. I've got one other, and it's not really about the game itself. If you can get past that hurdle, this is a good game. Now, the other complaint is Uplay. I had such a hassle getting this game functioning. I've owned this game for over a year at this point, and I've played it a couple of times before playing it for this Rumination. And having to log into Steam isn't really an issue. Having to log into Uplay, that can be aggravating. Having to log into the separate servers connected to Uplay, the DRM levels got aggravating, and I had to actually go and look up a few things and be like, okay, yes, this is me. Yes, here, what email did I use for this one? Okay, it's this one, hang on. Punch in the code, okay, here we go. It's the same as just about any Ubisoft game at this point in time on the PC. It's not something unique to this game. Now, this game is also an always online game. So there's a really weird type of thing in this game. I've already talked about how it's kind of a provincial game, right? Pseudo city, pseudo army, pseudo territorial, I guess is the word to use there. It's also a pseudo multiplayer game. You can, of course, just play multiplayer. In fact, there's a specific mode which will allow enemy players, as in, other people, to hop in and play on the same map as you. And of course, there's several modes deliberately designed to be playing online alongside other players. And there's this sort of it's actually kind of hard to describe because I'm not sure any other game's ever done this. There's a system where you can vote for the current leader, and your vote, you, the player's vote, actually is tallied up with all the other players still playing, and that determines who the leader is, which changes the pluses and minuses for your single-player game. Now, that doesn't affect the campaign, at least near as I could tell. I never saw anything about it affecting the campaign. I could be wrong. But it does affect single-player games, and it does affect multiplayer games. Just this, the free mode. I want to build a city, free map kind of stuff. And so you can actually have your experience in the single-player element of this be impacted by other players based on what they're voting on, or events that are going on in the world, stuff like that, right? It makes for an interesting experience. It just occurred to me, there's one other game that actually does the pseudo-multiplayer thing, Dark Souls. Although this is a slightly different direction, as that's almost exclusively a PvP kind of a thing. But you get the idea, right? It actually added an interesting twist to things. And I kind of liked the idea of it. But in practice, every time I popped on, the political vote, for example, always swayed the same way. It was towards the tech faction, towards Father. And I'm assuming that's because the benefits he gives are just plain better, or have been min-maxed to be better, or maybe that's just what people prefer. I don't know, but there was never any real debate on who exactly would win that one. Let's go back to the provincial gameplay thing, because there's one other thing I want to talk about really quick. The RTS element of this game is threadbare, basically, as is the territory gain type thing. The city stuff is actually really, really good. It's probably, I'd say, the meat of the game. If you've played a recent SimCity, not SimCity 5, but a good SimCity, or, say, City Skylines, you'll probably find yourself right at home, just with a few extra niggles. For example, and I know I already talked about this, but to rehash this point, you can't just build stuff because stuff requires different resources. There's not like a universal pool like, say, money in order to procure buildings or zone areas or whatnot. You want to build a residence, you need building materials. You want to build a power plant, you need money. And what I've noticed is that for the most part, especially in the early game, the early balance of what is reliant on what and what produces what, is such that things that cost money tend to produce other resources, and things that cost other resources tend to produce money. Or even more other resources. There's actually a web. You can actually look this up, no joke. You could look up images of like Anno interdependence or something like that, and you could see how everything relies on everything else. It's brilliantly balanced, actually. And once I got used to the swing of that and figuring out that I need to expand my my housing, and then expand my industry, and then expand my housing, and then expand my industry, and just kind of go back and forth as my credit and my resources change, it improved my enjoyment of the game substantially, especially since early on I had no idea what I was doing, and I was basically constantly hemorrhaging money like crazy, especially in the campaign mode. Yeah, the campaign mode is also very, very strange because it reminds me of some other campaigns I've seen in the past, including Ashes of the Singularity, which is a campaign we played through recently for explorations and for review, in that it's like you're given basically just the mode of the game and like one ship, and then you're told, okay, go make this happen. Okay, and you do this, and you make this happen, and you do this, and then the game just ends because successfully made a power plant, and then it moves on to the next mission, and it moves on to the next mission. It's not until the last chapter, and the final few missions in the last chapter, where it actually starts to feel like an actual campaign mode. I can't really spoil the story, or I should say the plot. I can't really spoil the main plot because they find a rogue, intelligent, self-adapting computer virus and hook it up to their self-aware AI. Honestly, you can probably guess the rest of the story from that point on. I mean, it writes itself, really. Although what I find amusing is in the expansion, apparently they rebuilt Father, and it was Father 2, and he's like, don't worry, it's okay, I'm fixed this time. Uh-huh. Did I mention Father's usually the leader of the world? And that's a good time to talk about the setting. I mentioned there was a lot of flavor lore. This is a world in which the polar ice caps have melted to some extent, and the water levels have risen substantially, to the point where a huge chunk of the coasts are just gone underwater. And most of the infrastructure of the continents has been massively destroyed and isn't really sustainable. There are still there are still surface areas on the continents, excuse me, that have the ability to sustain life and produce electricity and resources and all that. And there are still people who live on the continents, but for the most part, most of the actual exploration and work, which is the stuff that is the core chunk of the game, is done out on little islands, trying to exploit the islands that are left or that used to be continents or countries or whatever else, and trying to make use of them. There's this concept called the Ark, which is this massive, submersible naval base, basically, which has the ability to produce military units and whatnot. And you've got a lot of technology, which is specifically around the island idea. And I think that's one of the things I like most about it from a weirdly gameplay and story mentality. I'm one of those people who really likes to play civilization games on archipelago maps, where there's lots and lots of islands and lots of ocean. And that's basically this in a nutshell. You get to develop an island. You really have to be efficient. It's easy at first to look at this big island and be like, oh man, I got tons of room. It doesn't take very long, a few hours in, and you're like, oh my god, I've got no room to make anything. You have to be very efficient. It encourages efficient thinking and very careful planning, or very, throwing tons of money and resources into rebuilding entire quadrants of your city. And, of course, there's also the military, which takes a fairly large amount of resources, too, and you got to find out pirates or other units, and you can actually conquer enemy cities and take their resources, all that fun stuff. But there's also this underwater section. Now, when I first saw it, I thought it was vestigial. I thought it was just a thing that was like, okay, this is great, but why is this even here? I don't understand its purpose. The more I got into it, the more I liked it, and I started really getting into making underwater bases. Now, underwater bases, in pure gameplay terms, are basically the same as above-ground bases, but they're a lot more difficult to actually really get functioning. And usually, I don't know how to explain this better, they felt like I was making a new province. Like I was Portugal back during the Age of Exploration, It's like that was one of the settlements. I'm trying to think of a word other than province, but I keep coming with provincials. It was one of the settlements that had been, took people out and said, here, there's usually very useful, very valuable resources, most notably oil, that can be found underwater, and you really want that, and it's basically mandatory for some sections. Like, if you're going to get certain types of food, you pretty much have to have an underwater base. Here's the catch. You remember that detail-oriented thing? Well, all those resources you're mining, the oil and the algae and all the other fun stuff you're getting from that underwater base, that's at that underwater base, not at your home base. That's when you have to start to set up trade routes. And the trade route system is actually really neat, I think. You can adjust it on the fly and assign or deassign ships to it pretty much all willy-nilly. And you could say, well, I want you to ship this to here and this to here, get construction resources out to the undersea beast so they can expand, and then get the products they're producing back here. Make sure you're not taking away all your construction. There's a lot of micromanagement involved in that, and I really actually enjoyed that. You'll notice I haven't said anything more about the setting. I guess I really only have one other thing to say about the setting, and it's something I actually find interesting. The political stability of the world is wonky, but strangely unified. That makes sense. In a world which has basically reached a point of planetary crisis, it makes sense that the government of the world is effectively united. The thing is, when I say effectively, so there's 3 factions in this game. They're all basically, shall we say, branches of the same overarching political entity. You've got your initiative people who are all about trying to stabilize the environment and trying to make sure that things are functioning properly, and they're a bit snooty. Basically, they require more luxuries and resources to be happy than other people, and they produce far less because they're not destroying the environment to do it. You've got the corporate people who are Weyland-Yutani. Let's just say it. They are very, very active about all we care about is money, and all we care about is pillaging and destroying the environment. And so you can get tons and tons of money and resources with them very quickly, but environmental damage will very, very quickly cause very bad consequences for your island and can actually make it uninhabitable and basically wipe you out very quickly. You get a tsunami going, it's basically over. And then you've got the tech people who you can't actually join. You can, however, bribe them with a huge sum of money in order to be able to have access to some of their units. And The funny thing is, if you've been paying attention, the eco people, they have the disadvantage of requiring more luxuries and producing less. The corporate people have the advantage of producing more in just about every aspect, but also destroying the territory in doing so. The tech people have no disadvantage, really, other than the fact that you can't play as them, which kind of sucks. But it is nice getting access to their tech. That's it. That's all I got for the story. There really is nothing else. I mentioned the UE issues. I mentioned the trade routes. I mentioned the micromanagement. I'm just looking at my notes here. I don't really have much else to talk about. It was an interesting game. It's the kind of a game that I would probably enjoy more if I really had time for it. You know, like, well, this is going to be a weird relation, but like BattleTech, for example. I mean, actually, on the map with your actual figurines kind of BattleTech. That's the kind of thing I would get really into if I had a hellacious amount of spare time, because I know exactly how time-consuming and expensive that can be. It's the same thing here. If you want a game to really sink your teeth into for the next several weeks worth of game time, this is a good game for you. If you want a game to just build a city, go get City Skylines. And if you want a game to, conquer the world, there's a dozen other games for that one. But if you want that unique mix of provincial gameplay, city building, micromanagement, and detail-oriented function, this is a really good game. And actually, other than my big complaints, I have none. So I guess that's it. Surely there's something else. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I guess I'll probably make up for it next week. Because I know exactly what game I'm ruminating it on next week. Ugh. Anyways, I'll see you around next time, guys.